My wife has always had a knack for wanting change. She couldn't sit still, it was as if routine was a weight she needed to shake off constantly. I remember the day she came home from meeting her friend, looking more excited than usual. She told me about her friend, a wealthy woman with a sprawling estate, complete with a stable of horses. This friend of hers had apparently inspired my wife with a new idea. She wanted to get a horse for us. To say I was caught off guard would be an understatement. I mean, where were we supposed to keep a horse? We weren't living on some grand property, and our yard barely had enough room as it was with the garden, the kids' play area, and all the other stuff that comes with having a family. I asked her, plainly and directly, where she intended to keep this horse. We already had 2 dogs that demanded plenty of attention, 3 cats that did whatever they pleased, and of course, 2 kids who seemed to need everything from us every minute of the day. She laughed it off, saying that she could figure something out. That laugh just didn't sit right with me. It was carefree, but there was a hint of stubbornness in her eyes. I knew that look all too well. It was the look that told me she wasn't just going to drop this, and I needed to prepare myself for more conversations, or rather, more arguments, about it. To me, the idea was completely impractical. A horse was a massive responsibility, and for what? Just to fulfill some fleeting whim? I told her as much, and I didn't sugarcoat it. I laid out everything as clearly as I could. The costs, the maintenance, the space issues, all of it. I wasn't trying to be harsh, I was just being realistic. We had a family to take care of, and there was no place in our lives for some luxury pet that required constant upkeep. But instead of understanding, she looked at me like I was the one being unreasonable. She acted as if I was crushing her dreams, like I was the villain for pointing out what should have been obvious. I couldn't understand why she needed these changes all the time. It was always something, a new hobby, a new plan, a new way to shake things up. It wasn't like our lives were boring. We had 2 young kids, and that alone kept our hands more than full. The idea of adding a horse into that chaos felt like an absurd fantasy. But she couldn't see it that way. She was caught up in the excitement, probably fueled by that friend of hers. I didn't like that friend much. She always seemed to have these outlandish ideas, and my wife would come back from visiting her with her head full of nonsense that never fit into our lives. My wife seemed disappointed, even frustrated, that I wasn't immediately on board. She tried convincing me by talking about how it could be a great experience for the kids. She said they could learn responsibility, that it would be good for them to grow up around animals. I wasn't buying it. Our kids had plenty of opportunities to learn responsibility, feeding the dogs, helping with chores, keeping their rooms clean. They didn't need a horse for that. It felt like she was just grasping at reasons to justify something that was clearly unreasonable. I tried to remain calm, tried not to turn this into a full-blown argument, but it wasn't easy. She kept pushing, and I could feel my patience wearing thin. I told her, firmly, that it wasn't happening. We weren't getting a horse. We had more important things to focus on, our kids, our home, our lives as they were. Adding a horse into the mix would just make everything harder, and I wasn't willing to do that to our family. She looked at me like I was the bad guy, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty. But then I reminded myself why I was saying no. It wasn't about denying her happiness, it was about keeping our lives manageable, about not letting some whim throw everything into chaos. She stormed off eventually, clearly upset. I sat there for a while, thinking about everything. I wasn't trying to be the kind of husband who just says no to everything. I wanted her to be happy, but not at the cost of our family's stability. I had to be the one to keep us grounded, especially when she got these ideas in her head. Someone had to be the voice of reason, even if it meant being the one she was angry at. I could handle that if it meant keeping our family on track. That night, things were tense. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was short and cold. I could tell she was still thinking about the horse, still wishing I would change my mind. But I wasn't going to. I knew this wasn't just about a horse, it was about the kind of life we were building. I wanted stability, consistency, a life where our kids felt secure. I wasn't about to throw that away for some reckless idea, no matter how much she wanted it. And as much as I hated the silence between us, I knew I had made the right choice. My wife's obsession with getting a horse didn't just come out of nowhere. Every time she spent time with that friend of hers, it was like a switch flipped. I could always tell when she'd been around her, she'd come back with some new idea, some scheme that didn't fit into our lives but seemed incredibly important all of a sudden. This time, it was the horse. Apparently, this friend of hers had a pony living right there in her backyard, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. And, of course, now my wife wanted the same. I never liked that friend. She always seemed to fill my wife's head with nonsense, things that were impractical, things that didn't make sense for our family. I didn't think she understood what real responsibilities were. She had the money to afford all these whims without a second thought, and my wife would get caught up in that fantasy. It wasn't just about the horse, it was about everything. Whenever my wife was around her, she came back wanting more, as if what we had wasn't enough. I tried to be understanding at first. I knew my wife valued her friendship, and I didn't want to come across as the controlling husband who says she can't have friends. But the truth was, I saw the impact this woman had on her. She was always planting these ideas, these unrealistic dreams, and then it was on me to be the one to bring everything back to reality. I told my wife that I thought her friend was a bad influence. I said it plainly, without sugarcoating it. I knew it would make her upset, but I wasn't going to lie about how I felt. My wife, of course, didn't take it well. She said I was being judgmental, that I was always trying to crush her dreams. That wasn't it at all. It wasn't about her dreams, it was about making sure we didn't throw our lives into chaos over something that didn't make sense. I wanted her to be happy, but there had to be limits. We couldn't just do whatever came to mind without thinking it through, especially not when we had kids to take care of. But she didn't see it that way. She saw me as the enemy, the one who was standing in the way of what she wanted. The argument that followed wasn't pretty. She accused me of not supporting her, of always shooting down her ideas. I told her that someone had to be realistic, that it wasn't about not supporting her, it was about making smart decisions for our family. She didn't want to hear it. She said I was always negative, that I never wanted to do anything fun or different. It was frustrating, trying to get her to understand that this wasn't about being negative. It was about being practical. We weren't in a position to take on the kind of commitment a horse required, no matter how much she wanted it. It hurt to see her so upset, but I couldn't back down. I had to be the one to keep things steady, to make sure we weren't making decisions based on impulse. That friend of hers didn't have the same responsibilities we did. She didn't have 2 young kids depending on her. She didn't have to worry about making sure there was enough money for everything we needed. It was easy for her to suggest these things, but she wasn't the one who would have to deal with the consequences. After the argument, things were tense. My wife didn't talk to me much, and when she did, it was short and clipped. I knew she was still angry, still blaming me for not letting her have what she wanted. It wasn't that I didn't want her to be happy. I just knew that giving in to this wasn't the answer. We had to be realistic about what we could handle, and a horse wasn't it. I could handle her being angry at me if it meant keeping our family stable. I thought about that friend a lot in the days after. It wasn't just the horse, it was everything she represented. She was the kind of person who could do whatever she wanted without worrying about the consequences. But that wasn't our life. We had responsibilities, commitments, things that were more important than some fantasy. I wish my wife could see that, could understand why I was saying no. But it felt like, as long as that friend was in her ear, she was always going to want more, always going to see our life as something that needed changing. In the end, I knew this wasn't the last time we'd have this kind of argument. As long as that friend was around, there would always be something. Some new idea, some new dream that didn't fit into our reality. And I'd have to be the one to say no, to be the bad guy. It wasn't a role I liked, but it was one I was willing to take on if it meant keeping our family on track. After all the arguing, after all the back and forth about the horse, my wife finally came up with a compromise. She said she would settle for riding lessons. No horse of our own, no massive expense, just a few lessons at her friend's stable. It seemed like a reasonable solution, at least compared to the chaos of actually owning a horse. I could tell she still wasn't thrilled about not getting her way completely, but at least she was willing to meet me halfway. I had to give her credit for that. And, honestly, it was a relief to see her backing down from the whole let's buy a horse idea. She tried to make it a bit more light-hearted too. She threw in a joke about how maybe riding lessons would even come in handy in the bedroom. I could see she was trying to smooth things over, trying to make the best of it, and I played along. I laughed, told her if that's what it took to end the argument, then sure, she should go for it. In a way, I appreciated the joke. It meant she was willing to let the tension between us ease a little. After all the arguing, it was good to see her smiling again, even if it was just her trying to make a joke out of a frustrating situation. Once we agreed on it, she wasted no time. Within a few days, she had already arranged everything with her friend, signed herself up, and was talking about her first lesson. She didn't go into much detail, though. It was all just general descriptions, how she was excited to ride again, how the horses were well trained. I stayed out of it for the most part. I figured if this was something she wanted that badly, she could take care of it herself. I wasn't going to stand in her way as long as it didn't upend everything else we had going on. She was excited about it, and I could see a little of that spark come back. It was something she could look forward to, something that was hers, and I was fine with that. The first lesson came, and she came home talking a mile a minute. She told me about the horse she had ridden, how the instructor had been nice, and how she had loved every second of it. I listened, nodding along, trying to be supportive. It wasn't really my thing, but if it made her happy, then fine. She didn't share many specifics, just the basics, but she seemed genuinely happy. I gave her the praise she was looking for, told her it sounded great. And it was nice, honestly, to see her happy again without it turning into a fight. After a few lessons, it became clear that this was more than just a passing interest. She was coming home from each session with stories, talking about how she was getting better, how the instructor was teaching her more advanced techniques. I'd nod, listen, and tell her I was glad she was enjoying herself. It seemed like a decent enough compromise. She got her time with the horses, and I didn't have to deal with the chaos of actually owning one. It was something she could do for herself, a little bit of freedom, and it kept her from pushing for more. That, in itself, was a win in my book. She never invited me to come watch her ride, and honestly, that was fine by me. I wasn't really interested, and it was probably better that way. She'd come home, tell me about how it went, and I'd give her the thumbs up, pretending to understand what was going on. It wasn't my scene, but seeing her so focused, so determined, I could appreciate that she had found something she genuinely liked. It was better than the constant arguments, better than her feeling restless at home. If this was what she needed to feel satisfied, I could put up with it. Still, there was a part of me that wondered how long it would last. My wife had a history of jumping into things headfirst and then losing interest once the novelty wore off. I couldn't help but think that maybe this was just another phase. But for now, it seemed like it was sticking. She wasn't talking about buying a horse anymore, and she wasn't pushing for more than we could handle. The lessons were enough for her, and that was good enough for me. I'd take the peace where I could get it. In the end, the riding lessons turned out to be a decent compromise. She got to live out her horse dreams, at least in part, without us having to turn our lives upside down. I got to keep things steady at home, without the added chaos of another animal to take care of. It wasn't perfect, but it was a middle ground we could both live with. And maybe that was the best outcome I could have hoped for. We weren't fighting about it anymore, and she was happy. Sometimes, that's all you can ask for. After my wife started her riding lessons, I began to notice a few changes in her behavior. She started coming home later than usual. At first, it was just a few minutes, then it stretched into hours. She always had some excuse, the lessons had run long, or she'd stayed back to help out at the stable. I tried not to think much of it, but it was hard to ignore. What really stood out to me, though, was how she'd come back in such a good mood. I mean, usually after a long day or some serious physical activity, people are tired. They're worn out, ready to relax. But she seemed more energized, more upbeat than I'd ever seen her. She'd walk in, all smiles, like she was coming home from a party instead of from riding lessons. It wasn't what I expected, and it didn't sit right with me. I knew what it was like to be exhausted after a long day. You're supposed to want to come home, take a shower, and crash on the couch. But she'd come in practically glowing, talking a mile a minute about how much fun she'd had, how great the horses were, and how much she was learning. I'd nod along, trying to keep up, but there was something about it that just felt off. Maybe it was the sudden enthusiasm or the way she'd brush off any questions about why she was getting home so late. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who doubts his wife at every turn. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, to trust that she was just really enjoying herself. But as the days went on, I couldn't help but notice that her mood seemed almost too good to be true. She wasn't just happy, she was almost giddy, like a teenager with a crush. I'd ask her how her day was, and she'd launch into stories about the stable, the horses, the instructor. She always seemed to mention the instructor, saying how helpful he was, how he was teaching her new techniques. There was a casualness to the way she said it, but something about it put me on edge. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to start another argument, especially after we had just found a compromise that seemed to work for both of us. But the late nights kept getting later, and her explanation started to wear thin. She'd tell me that she'd lost track of time, or that she'd stayed back to help clean up. It didn't make sense to me. She'd come home looking like she'd barely broken a sweat, still dressed neatly, hair perfect. It wasn't what I expected from someone who'd just spent hours at a stable. I'd been around horses before, they're messy, dirty animals. You don't come away from them looking like you just stepped out of a salon. I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself that I was just overthinking it. Maybe she was just enjoying herself more than I realized. Maybe she was finding something in these lessons that made her feel good, something that took her away from the stress of our everyday lives. But the more I tried to convince myself, the harder it became to ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. She was different. Not in a bad way, necessarily, but in a way that made me feel like I was missing something, like there was a part of her life that I wasn't a part of anymore. It wasn't just the late nights and the good mood. She seemed more distant, too. When she was home, she was still attentive to the kids, still doing all the things she always did, but there was something missing. It felt like her mind was somewhere else, like she was only half present. I'd catch her staring off into space sometimes, a small smile on her face, and when I'd ask her what she was thinking about, she'd just shrug and say nothing. It wasn't like her to be so vague. She'd always been open with me, always willing to share what was on her mind. But now, it felt like there was a wall between us, something she didn't want me to see. One night, I decided to ask her directly. I waited until the kids were in bed, and I asked her why she'd been coming home so late, why she seemed so different. She looked at me, surprised, like she hadn't realized I'd noticed. She gave me the same answer she always did, that the lessons were running late, that she was just having a good time. I nodded, but I could tell she was holding something back. There was a hesitation in her voice, a flicker of something in her eyes that made me think she wasn't telling me the whole story. I didn't push it. I let it go, but the feeling stayed with me. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that everything was fine, that she was just enjoying herself and that I was reading too much into it. But the changes were hard to ignore. She was happier, sure, but it felt like a happiness that didn't include me. It was like she'd found something else, something outside of our family, that gave her a sense of joy that I couldn't compete with. I didn't know what to do with that feeling. Part of me wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but another part of me was afraid of what I might find out. So I kept quiet, hoping that whatever it was, it would pass, and things would go back to normal. One evening, I found myself unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was late, the house was quiet, and my wife was in the shower. I don't know what came over me, but I decided to take a look in her bag. I'm not proud of it. It's not the kind of thing I ever thought I'd do, but the unease had been eating away at me for weeks. I felt like I needed some kind of answer, even if it wasn't one I wanted to hear. Her bag was sitting there on the kitchen counter, and before I could talk myself out of it, I unzipped it and started looking inside. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find. Maybe I thought I'd see something that would put my mind at ease, a harmless explanation for why she'd been acting differently. But what I found only made things worse. Inside her bag, I found a neatly folded set of dry clothes. That in itself wasn't all that strange. She'd mentioned before that sometimes she'd change after her lessons. But then, underneath the clothes, I saw something that made my stomach drop, a pack of condoms, and not just any condoms, extra large ones. I just stood there for a moment, staring at them, my mind racing. There was no reason for her to have those. None. My heart started pounding, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I knew I shouldn't be looking through her things, that this wasn't the way to handle whatever was going on between us, but I couldn't help it. I needed answers, and what I was seeing only raised more questions. Why would she have those? She hadn't mentioned anything about needing condoms, and we hadn't used them in years. It didn't make sense, and the more I thought about it, the worse I felt. My mind started going to dark places, thinking about all the things that could be happening behind my back. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard the water shut off in the bathroom. Panic set in. I quickly shoved everything back into her bag, trying to put it back exactly the way I'd found it. My hands were shaking, and I could barely think straight. I zipped the bag closed just as I heard her footsteps coming down the hall. I stepped away from the counter, trying to look casual, like I hadn't just been rifling through her things. She walked into the kitchen, towel wrapped around her hair, and gave me a smile. I forced myself to smile back, my heart still pounding in my chest. She didn't seem to notice anything was off. She walked over to the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and started talking about her day. I nodded along, barely hearing what she was saying. My mind was still on what I'd found, trying to figure out what it meant. I couldn't bring myself to ask her about it, not yet. I didn't even know how I'd begin to explain why I was looking through her bag in the first place. So I just stood there, pretending everything was fine, even though nothing felt fine anymore. That night, I lay in bed next to her, staring up at the ceiling. She fell asleep quickly, as if nothing was wrong, but I couldn't close my eyes. Every time I tried, I saw those condoms, saw her smiling face, and it made me feel sick. I wanted to believe there was some kind of reasonable explanation, something that would make all of this make sense, but I couldn't think of anything. The doubts that had been gnawing at me for weeks were now screaming in my head, and I didn't know how to quiet them. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thoughts kept swirling in my mind, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on. My wife lay next to me, fast asleep, her breathing slow and steady. I watched her for a while, torn between the urge to trust her and the gnawing suspicion that I couldn't ignore. Eventually, I decided I needed to know for sure. I reached over to her nightstand and picked up her phone. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. I knew this was wrong. I knew that going through her phone was a breach of trust, but I felt like I had no choice. The doubts were eating me alive, and I needed answers. I unlocked her phone, my heart pounding in my chest, and opened her messages. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for, her conversation with her friend. I scrolled through the messages, my stomach churning with each new line I read. She was complaining about me. About the kids. About how exhausting it all was, how she felt like she couldn't catch a break. She said she was tired of the constant demands, tired of always having to be the one holding everything together. I felt a pang of guilt reading it. Maybe I hadn't been as supportive as I thought. Maybe I'd been too caught up in my own worries to see how much she was struggling. But then I kept scrolling, and what I saw next made my blood run cold. She was talking about someone else, some guy she'd been seeing. She didn't mention his nim, just referred to him as he or him, but it was clear what she meant. She talked about how exciting it was, how it made her feel alive again. She said she hadn't felt this way in years, that it was like a breath of fresh air. My hand started to shake as I read her words, each one feeling like a dagger to the chest. She was having an affair. There was no other way to interpret it. I kept reading, unable to stop myself. Her friend was encouraging her, telling her she deserved to be happy, that she shouldn't feel guilty for wanting more out of life. They talked about meeting up again, at the stable, just like last time. My heart sank. It wasn't just a one-time thing. This had been going on for a while, and they had plans to see each other again. This Saturday. I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and a deep, aching sadness that I couldn't put into words. Everything I'd been worried about, everything I'd suspected, was true. I put the phone back on her nightstand, my hand still trembling. I lay back down, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to wake her up right then and there, to confront her, to demand answers. But another part of me was too stunned to move, too overwhelmed by what I'd just learned. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie. I couldn't believe this was happening. I couldn't believe she'd do this to me, to our family. I lay there for hours, my mind replaying everything I'd read, every word she'd written. The way she talked about me, about our kids, it was like we were just burdens to her, obstacles in the way of her happiness. It hurt more than I could have imagined. I'd always thought we were in this together, that no matter how hard things got, we'd face it as a team. But now it felt like she'd already moved on, like she'd found something better, and I was just too blind to see it. As the first light of dawn started to filter through the curtains, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. I needed time to think, to figure out what I was going to do. I couldn't just act on impulse, not when our kids were involved, not when there was so much at stake. I needed to be smart about this, to make sure that whatever happened next, I was doing what was best for them. But one thing was clear, things were never going to be the same again. The trust was gone, shattered by what I'd read, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. The next day, my wife came to me in the kitchen while I was drinking my morning coffee. She looked a little hesitant, her eyes not quite meeting mine, and she told me that her mom wasn't feeling well. She said she needed to go help her out for a few days, maybe the whole weekend. She kept her voice calm, steady, but there was something in the way she said it that made my gut twist. I knew her too well. I could see the little tells, the way she avoided looking directly at me, the slight tremor in her voice. It was all too familiar, and I knew she was lying. She went on, explaining how her mother had been feeling under the weather and that she could really use some extra help around the house. She said it in a way that seemed rehearsed, like she'd practiced the lines in her head before coming to talk to me. I nodded along, keeping my expression as neutral as I could manage. I didn't want her to know that I already had my suspicions, that I knew this wasn't about her mom at all. But I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the anger and hurt from the night before still fresh. I told her that I understood, that she should go if her mom needed her. I even tried to sound supportive, asking if there was anything she needed me to do while she was gone. She smiled, a quick, almost relieved smile, and said no, she had everything covered. She thanked me for being understanding, and then she turned away, moving quickly, like she didn't want to give me time to ask any more questions. I watched her go, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite put into words, anger, sadness, betrayal. She was standing there, lying to my face, and I had to pretend like everything was fine. The thing was, I knew her mom wasn't sick. We'd spoken just a couple of days ago, and she'd been fine. In fact, she'd mentioned how excited she was to have some quiet time to herself, how she'd finally get around to working on her garden. There had been no mention of feeling unwell, no hint that she needed help. My wife must have assumed I wouldn't check, that I'd just take her word for it. And I guess, on the surface, I was doing just that, playing the part of the trusting husband. But inside, I was already making my own plans. I decided I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I'd let her think that everything was going according to her plan, but I'd be watching. I didn't know what I'd do yet, but I couldn't just sit back and pretend like nothing was happening. I had to know for sure. I had to see with my own eyes if what I'd read in those messages was true. The thought of her meeting that man again, of her lying to me so she could go off and be with him, made my blood boil. I couldn't confront her without proof, but I wasn't just going to let this slide. I spent the rest of the day going through the motions, acting like everything was normal. I played with the kids, made them lunch, tried to keep my mind off what I knew was coming. But every time I looked at my wife, I felt a pang of resentment. She was cheerful, almost too cheerful, like she was relieved to have a way out. She packed her bag in the afternoon, throwing in just enough clothes for a few days, and thanked me again for understanding. I forced myself to smile, to tell her it was no problem, but inside, I was seething. That night, after I put the kids to bed, I sat in the living room, staring at my phone. I had her mom's number saved, and I thought about calling, about confirming once and for all that she wasn't there. But I stopped myself. I didn't need to call. I already knew the truth. What I needed now was proof, something that would show her that I wasn't as blind as she thought. Something that would make her face what she'd done. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Saturday morning came, and my wife left just as she said she would. She gave me a kiss on the cheek, told me she'd be back in a couple of days, and then she was gone. I watched her car disappear down the street, and once she was out of sight, I went back inside, my mind already set on what I needed to do. I knew she wasn't going to her mother's, and I wasn't about to sit around and do nothing. I needed to see it for myself, to prove that what I suspected was true. So, after making sure everything was in order for the kids, I got in my car and headed out. The drive to her parents' place felt like it took forever. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, my knuckles white from the tension. I was trying to stay calm, trying to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. I had that feeling in my gut, the one that wouldn't go away, the one that kept telling me that something was very, very wrong. When I finally pulled into her parents' driveway, I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself before getting out of the car. Her parents were surprised to see me, but they were friendly as always. They welcomed me in, offered me a cup of coffee, and we sat down in their living room. I tried to make small talk, but I couldn't help myself. I asked about my wife, about how she was doing and whether she had arrived yet. Her mother gave me a confused look, then said she hadn't seen her. She looked at her husband, who shook his head, equally puzzled. I forced a smile, nodded, and told them that maybe she was running late or had gotten caught up on the way. But inside, my heart sank. I knew she wasn't coming. I sat there for a while longer, pretending to listen to her parents talk, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. All the doubts, all the fears I'd been trying to push away were now right in front of me. She wasn't here. She'd lied to me, lied to them, and I was the only one who seemed to know what was really going on. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I set my coffee cup down, thanked them for their hospitality, and stood up to leave. Her mother looked concerned, asked if everything was okay, and I just nodded, forcing another smile that didn't reach my eyes. As I walked back to my car, I knew what I had to do next. The stable. That was where she said she'd be meeting him, the place her friend had mentioned in the messages. I wasn't sure what I'd find there, but I needed to know. I couldn't keep living with the uncertainty, with the questions that had no answers. I turned to her parents, who had followed me out to the driveway, and I asked if they'd like to come with me. I told them I thought it might be nice to surprise her, to show up and see how she was doing. They seemed a little confused but agreed, and soon enough, we were all in my car, driving towards the stable. The drive was quiet, her parents chatting occasionally, unaware of the real reason we were going. I kept my eyes on the road, my mind racing with thoughts of what I might find. I hoped, in some small part of me, that I was wrong. That maybe she really was there, that she was just running errands before heading to her parents. But the closer we got, the more that hope faded. I knew what I was going to find. I knew it wasn't going to be the innocent explanation I desperately wanted it to be. We pulled up to the stable, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Her parents looked around, curious, as I parked the car. I got out, my eye scanning the area, looking for any sign of her. The place was quiet, a few people milling around, but no sign of my wife. Her parents followed me as I walked towards the entrance, and we had arrived at the stable. We walked into the stable, the smell of hay and animals heavy in the air. Her parents were still looking around, clearly expecting to see my wife going about her riding lesson. I kept my eye scanning the area, my heart pounding, and I had a sinking feeling that this was not going to end well. As we moved further in, the noises from one of the larger enclosed areas caught my attention, laughter, voices, something that didn't quite fit with the quiet activity of a normal riding lesson. I motioned for her parents to follow me, my gut tightening as I led the way. When we rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. There was a group of people gathered near the horses, but this wasn't any normal group activity. Some of them were naked, others partially clothed, and it quickly became clear what was happening. My heart sank, and I felt my stomach turn. They were involved in something twisted, something that went far beyond what anyone would expect to see in a stable. The horses stood there, some being petted, others just lingering as if this was an ordinary day. I scanned the group, hoping, praying that maybe my wife wasn't part of this, that maybe I was wrong. But then I saw her. She was in the center of it all, completely naked, her body illuminated by the dim light filtering through the stable windows. It felt like time stopped. I could barely breathe as I watched her, her face flushed, her expression one of pleasure. She was laughing, her hands moving over the man beside her, her body entwined with his. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat, the sight almost too much to bear. Her parents were just behind me, their eyes wide as they took in the scene. Her mother let out a gasp, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Her father, standing rigid beside her, looked like he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. He stepped forward, his face pale, and called out her name, his voice cracking in disbelief. The sound of his voice cut through the noise in the stable, and everything seemed to come to a sudden halt. The laughter, the movements, all of it stopped as everyone turned to look in our direction. My wife turned, her eyes going wide as she saw us standing there. Her face drained of color, the smile vanishing instantly. She looked like she had seen a ghost, her body frozen as she took in the sight of her parents, and then me, standing there, watching her. There was a moment of complete silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that hung in the air. I could see the shock, the fear in her eyes, the realization of what she had done and who had just seen it. For a moment, no one moved. The people around her looked at us, some of them scrambling to cover themselves, others just standing there, dumbfounded. My wife didn't move, didn't say anything. She just stood there, her eyes locked on her father, who was staring at her with a look of utter disbelief and heartbreak. Her mother was crying, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back the sobs that were now escaping her. I felt like I was in a nightmare, like none of this could possibly be real. I wanted to say something, to yell, to demand an explanation, but no words came out. I just stood there, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, my whole body trembling with a mix of anger, betrayal, and disgust. This was the woman I had married, the mother of my children, and here she was, doing something so vile, so beyond anything I could have imagined. The sight of her, standing there with those people, was like a knife to the heart. Her father finally spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. He called her name again, and this time it was filled with pain, with confusion. She took a step towards us, her lips moving as if she was trying to say something, but no sound came out. The rest of the group started to disperse, some of them slipping away into the shadows of the stable, leaving my wife standing there, alone and exposed. I turned away, unable to look at her any longer, the weight of what I had seen crushing me from the inside out. The ride back home was one of the longest and most painful experiences I've ever been through. After the shock of what we had just witnessed, my wife's parents were both in a state of disbelief. Her mother was sitting in the passenger seat beside me, sobbing quietly, while her father sat in the back, staring blankly out the window, his face pale and ashen. No one spoke. The silence in the car was suffocating, filled only by the sound of her mother's quiet cries and the occasional sniffle. I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles were white, my mind a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion. When we finally reached their home, her father seemed to come to life, if only for a moment. He got out of the car, his movement stiff and jerky, like he was in a daze. Her mother followed, her face streaked with tears, and I helped her out, not knowing what else to do. She leaned heavily on me, her body trembling as we made our way inside. I felt numb, like I was just going through the motions, my mind still trying to process what we'd just seen. My wife's father sat down heavily in his chair, his eyes vacant, like the life had been drained out of him. It was her mother who finally broke the silence. She stood in the middle of the room, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. She dialed the number with a sense of determination that seemed to come out of nowhere, her voice cracking as she spoke to the operator. She told them what had happened, her voice trembling, the words coming out in broken, halting sentences. She told them where they had been, what they had seen, and that they needed to send someone to the stable. I could hear the disbelief in her voice, like she couldn't quite believe she was saying the words out loud. Her father just sat there, his head in his hands, shaking slightly. He didn't say a word as his wife made the call, as she gave the details to the operator, her voice rising in pitch as she tried to convey the horror of what we'd witnessed. When she finally hung up, she just stood there for a moment, her shoulders slumping, as if all the energy had drained out of her. She turned to look at her husband, her eyes filled with tears, and he just shook his head, unable to meet her gaze. It was then that her father spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He said that their daughter was no longer welcome in their home. He said it with a finality that made my heart sink, his words heavy with pain and disgust. Her mother nodded, her face crumpling as she let out a choked sob. They both looked broken, like they had aged 10 years in the span of a few hours. I felt a pang of sadness for them, for what they were going through, for the betrayal they were feeling. It wasn't supposed to be like this. None of it was. The decision to cut her out of their lives seemed to come almost naturally after that. Her father spoke again, his voice growing stronger as he said that she was no longer their daughter, that she was no longer part of their family. Her mother nodded, wiping at her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line. They talked about removing her from the will, about making sure she had no claim to anything they'd worked for. It was like they needed to do it, like they needed to take that step to make it real, to make it final. I stayed quiet, just listening, my own emotions too tangled to even find words. Part of me understood why they were doing it, why they felt they had no choice. But another part of me was struggling to reconcile the woman I had known, the woman I had loved, with the person we had just seen. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But there was no going back now. The damage was done, and there was no way to undo it. Her mother eventually got up, moving to the kitchen to make some tea, her movement slow and deliberate, as if she was trying to hold herself together. Her father stayed in his chair, staring at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. I felt a deep sadness settle over me, a sadness that seemed to swallow everything else. I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The family I had married into, the woman I had built a life with, it was all shattered, broken beyond repair. And as I sat there, the weight of it all pressing down on me, I realized that there was no way forward that didn't end in more pain. The weeks that followed were a blur. The shock of what I had seen in the stable still haunted me, but there was no time to dwell on it. I had to act, to make decisions that would protect my children and give us a chance to move forward. The first step was filing for divorce. It was a decision that came easily after everything that had happened. There was no saving our marriage, no path to forgiveness. What she had done was beyond anything I could ever accept, and I knew that staying together would only create more pain for everyone involved. I met with a lawyer, and the process began. It was strange, sitting in that office, talking about dividing our lives, our home, our assets, our children. There was no anger, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. It was all very matter-of-fact, almost cold. I just wanted it over with. I wanted to move on, to put as much distance between myself and the memories of what she had done as I could. My focus was on the kids, on making sure they were okay, that they would be shielded from as much of this mess as possible. When the papers were served, she didn't fight it. She knew there was nothing left to fight for. She moved out, taking only what she needed, and went to stay with her friend, the same friend who had been there for her through all of this, the one who had encouraged her reckless behavior. I didn't care. She could have her friend, her freedom, whatever it was she thought she needed. I was done. My priority was my children, and I wasn't going to let anything get in the way of giving them the stability they needed. The house felt empty without her, but it was a good kind of empty. There was no more tension, no more lies. It was just me and the kids, and I could feel a sense of peace slowly beginning to return. Her parents, despite everything, were supportive. They were just as devastated as I was by what had happened, and they wanted to help in any way they could. They began coming by regularly, helping with the kids, offering to take them for a weekend here and there to give me a break. It was strange, but also comforting. They were still family, even if their daughter no longer was. I focused on creating a new routine for the kids, something that would help them feel secure. I made breakfast every morning, packed their lunches, took them to school. In the evenings, we'd sit down for dinner together, talk about their day, and I'd read to them before bed. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the weight of it all felt like too much, when the loneliness crept in and I found myself staring at the empty space where she used to sit. But I pushed through it. I had to. For them. The divorce was finalized quickly, and I was granted full custody. She didn't contest it. I think she knew that she couldn't provide the kind of stability the kids needed, not after everything that had happened. She came by once or twice, trying to see them, but it was awkward, uncomfortable for everyone. The kids didn't understand why she had left, why everything had changed, and I didn't have the heart to tell them the full truth. I just told them that their mom needed some time, that she loved them, but that she couldn't be here right now. It was the best I could do. Slowly, life began to settle into a new normal. The kids adapted, and I found myself learning how to be both a father and, in many ways, a mother to them. Her parents were a big help, always willing to step in when I needed them. They were as committed to the kids as I was, and I was grateful for that. It wasn't the life I had planned, not by a long shot, but it was a life that I could work with. It was a life that, in time, I hoped would bring some happiness back to all of us. There were still moments when the pain of what had happened would hit me out of nowhere, a song on the radio, a familiar smell, a memory of better times. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. I was moving forward, one day at a time, and I was determined to give my kids the best life I could. The past was behind us, and while it would always be a part of our story, it didn't have to define our future. We were going to be okay. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually, we would be okay.